The blaze had started in the underbrush, a cruel accident sparked by dry wind and carelessness near the edge of the canyon woods. By the time Eliza saw the orange glow dancing through the trees, it was already racing toward the abandoned cornfield below her homestead. She didn't scream or run, just grabbed a wool blanket and a dented tin pail and sprinted downhill into the smoke. Her lungs burned and her skirts snagged on brush, but she pushed forward, swatting embers and splashing dirt and water where she could. Then came the screech, a piercing, raw sound that cut through the roar of fire like a cry for mercy. She turned and saw it, a falcon, crumpled near a burning log, one wing twisted beneath its body, feathers smoldering. Without thinking, Eliza dropped to her knees, threw the blanket over the bird, and scooped it up into her arms, cradling it like something sacred. Her hands blistered instantly from the heat, but she didn't let go. She staggered back uphill, smoke chasing her like a phantom, until she collapsed just outside her door. For hours, she nursed the falcon on her porch, fingers trembling as she plucked singed feathers and dabbed cool cloth along its scorched side. The bird didn't fight, just watched her with one unblinking eye, black and knowing. By midnight, the flames had died down, and the sky opened with stars, silent and disinterested in what had burned. Eliza sat beside the bird, rocking slightly, too tired to cry. Her hands throbbed, and her clothes still smelled of smoke, but her mind was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. That's when she noticed it, something resting against her porch rail. A bough, hand-carved, dark as night, and tied with a strip of doeskin dyed red. No one had approached, no sound had warned her. Yet it was there, leaning gently against the wood like it belonged. She rose, clutching her scorched hands to her chest, and stared into the tree line, but saw nothing except darkness. The falcon stirred beside her. Somewhere, deep in the trees, a single drumbeat echoed and vanished. Eliza didn't know what she'd done or what it meant, but something had changed. Something old and sacred had watched her carry a dying creature from the fire, and left behind a sign that she was no longer alone. She whispered thank you to no one, and sat with the falcon until dawn. The morning light was soft and golden, casting long shadows across the porch where Eliza had fallen asleep sitting up. The falcon nestled in a wool-lined crate beside her. When she opened her eyes, she half expected the night to have vanished like a fever dream. But the bow was still there, smooth, heavy, and humming with some weight she couldn't name. She brought it inside, set it gently on the table, and stared at it as the falcon stirred and clicked its beak softly, almost as if it approved. Her burned hands ached as she tied gauze around the worst of the blisters, but she said nothing, did nothing except work silently. That had always been her way. Talk less, do more. Survive. She had come west alone 2 years ago after her brother died in Tennessee, thinking she'd find peace in the quiet land. What she found was drought, loneliness, and a homestead the wind seemed determined to erase. Yet now there was this bough, this offering, warning. She wasn't sure. When she stepped out to feed the mule, she saw them. Faint footprints in the dirt, not made by boots but moccasins, leading up to the porch and back into the woods. She followed them part way, heart pounding, but they vanished near the riverbank where the frost hadn't yet lifted. That night, she laid out the bough again, this time not on the porch rail, but on a folded blanket just beyond the steps, like a return offering. Then she waited by the fire inside, peeking through the curtains long after dusk fell. Nothing happened. But at first light, the bow was gone. In its place lay a small pouch of herbs and 2 river stones, smoothed flat and warm to the touch, as if they'd held body heat. She brought them inside slowly, aware now that someone watched her from the tree line. Someone who had seen what she'd done. Maybe even known the Falcon. She began to brew the herbs into a poultice and pressed it against the bird's chest, murmuring apologies to it, to the land, to the unknown hands that left gifts in silence. She didn't understand the rules being played, but something ancient was moving, like smoke curling into patterns she couldn't read. That evening, a second bough appeared, smaller and carved with a snake winding up its length. It was leaned not against her porch, but against the gate to her field, closer. She understood then that this wasn't over. She hadn't just saved a falcon. She had stepped unknowingly into someone else's sacred story. By the third day, the falcon stood upright, its remaining feathers fluffed against the morning chill, eyes alert and sharp. Eliza smiled at it from her kitchen table, stirring cornmeal into boiling water with bandaged fingers. She'd started speaking to it like a friend, as if naming her thoughts aloud kept her from drifting too far into silence. "You brought someone here," she said softly. "Or maybe they brought you." But what unsettled her more than the falcon's recovery was the growing presence she felt just beyond her land. Not dangerous. No. But watchful. On the fourth night she saw him. Not a shadow or guess, but a man. He stood at the edge of her field beneath a cottonwood, tall and still, wrapped in a buffalo hide cloak. The moon gave him shape, but not detail. She didn't scream or move. She just stepped onto her porch and looked back. They stood like that for a long time, the space between them filled only by wind. Then he lifted one hand, slow, palm open, and turned to vanish into the dark. The next morning she found a painted feather resting on her firewood pile. It had been dipped in clay and carved with a spiral, and somehow she knew it hadn't been left by accident. She didn't touch it. Instead, she walked the edge of her property with a quiet purpose, feeling for something she didn't yet understand. She found a small circle made of stones and cedar branches laid out near her corn rows, as if a blessing, or a boundary, had been placed. That evening, she built a second fire beside it and sat cross-legged, the falcon resting beside her, head tucked into its wing. As the flames crackled, she took a deep breath and said the words that had been locked in her chest for years. "I don't know what I'm part of, but I want to learn." The fire snapped louder, and she felt the hair on her arms rise. The man returned that night, not as a silhouette, but as a figure who stepped halfway into the firelight. He was Apache. She could tell by the red beads woven into his braids and the markings along his jaw. His eyes never left hers, calm but unreadable. He placed something near the circle, a carved talisman shaped like a hawk, and then turned and disappeared once more. Eliza held her breath for a long time after he was gone. She realized the fire had become something more than warmth now. It was a doorway, and the man who watched from its edge had invited her to step through, one symbol at a time. Snow began to fall in soft threads the following morning, quieting the land and covering the footprints that had become a map of mystery across her yard. Eliza sat by the fire, stroking the falcon's chest, feeling the tiny tremble of breath beneath its feathers. She hadn't meant to care this much. But each day that passed, she found herself more tethered, to the bird, to the woods, to the man who came and went like a ghost with gifts in his hands. She hadn't dared follow him. Not yet. That day, she gathered the carved hawk talisman and the spiral feather and set them on her windowsill, where they caught the gray light. She didn't know what they meant, only that they were invitations. She whispered to the falcon, "You need a name," and the words felt heavier than expected, like naming the bird might unlock something larger. She looked out toward the tree line, and, without understanding why, said, "Casey." It came from nowhere, or maybe from the land itself. The Falcon blinked once, slowly, as if accepting it. That night she placed the name into the circle, scratched it into a strip of bark, and laid it beside the fire again. The snow thickened, and the flames danced higher, but she stayed out until her lips went numb. When she finally stood, something glinted from beneath the edge of the firewood stack. A string of beads, deep blue and polished with wear, with a single bone carved into the shape of a claw. She knew immediately it had been left for her. The Apache man was no longer simply thanking her. He was teaching her, giving her pieces of a language older than words. Days passed, and though she didn't see him again, the Falcon grew stronger. Its broken wing would never carry it fully again, but it began to climb to the rafters and rest beneath the beams like a watchman. Eliza found herself dreaming more vividly. Visions of wide plains, echoing drums, smoke rising from signal fires, and always a hawk circling above. Sometimes, in the dream, she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, silent but steady, bow in hand, eyes on the horizon. She began to believe the dreams were memories. Not hers, but ones she was being allowed to borrow. On the 7th night, as wind howled outside and snow piled against the door, she found something new in the circle. A single hawk feather threaded through her own name, carved in wood. The man knew her name. And somehow, she knew his would come next. The winds settled the next morning, leaving behind a world hushed beneath white. Eliza stepped outside wrapped in wool, eyes scanning the forest edge with a quiet hunger she hadn't known she carried. Her porch bore no fresh gifts, no new signs, but the fire circle still stood, untouched by snow as if some unseen hand had kept it warm. She knelt beside it and laid new wood on the embers, watching the flames catch and twist upward like smoke rising from a sacred breath. This time, she brought a name of her own to give. She carved it with care onto a fresh strip of bark, Cassie, and next to it, her own, Eliza. She laid them both in the center and whispered into the fire, "I see you, even if I don't understand yet." The wind carried her words outward, and something inside her shifted. That night, while sleep hovered near but never took her fully, she heard a sound outside. Not footsteps, not wind, but a quiet rhythm. She stepped onto the porch barefoot, drawn forward despite the cold, and saw him again. This time he stood closer. His face was partially shadowed by a thick, fur-lined hood, but his eyes met hers with a clarity that rooted her to the spot. He raised one hand slowly, not in greeting but offering, and held out a thin length of birch bark. She stepped forward and took it. No words passed between them, but something deeper did. A silence that spoke of trust forming in the frozen spaces between fire and snow. When she looked down to read the birch bark, he was gone. On it was carved a single word: Taza. She didn't know what it meant, not fully, but it was his name. She could feel it settle into her like warmth after cold. Taza, the man who moved like a shadow, but left light in his path. The next day, she added the birch bark strip to the altar she'd begun to build on her mantle. 3 feathers, 4 stones, the talismans, and now his name. She spoke it aloud once, and the Falcon called in reply from the rafters. That evening, when she built the fire again, she did so with intention. Not just for warmth, but to hold the space between them. She sat beside it long into the night, whispering stories of her past to the flames, not knowing if he was listening from the trees, but hoping. The fire no longer belonged to her alone. It was a place they both returned to, even without words. And as she spoke his name again, The falcon spread its wings above her, casting a long shadow against the cabin wall. The snow returned in the morning, thick and quiet, cloaking the land like a veil. Eliza woke to find the falcon perched on the windowsill, its sharp eyes trained on the woods as if sensing something she could not. She stepped outside, bundled against the cold, and found the fire circle undisturbed, but waiting. She had begun to think of it that way, as a living thing. That morning, there was something new beside it, a bundle wrapped in tanned hide, tied with sinew, and still warm to the touch. Her heart thudded as she knelt and unwrapped it. Inside lay a charred piece of antler, carved with delicate etchings, mountains, a rising sun, and the unmistakable shape of a falcon mid-flight. Beneath it rested a pinch of ashes wrapped in cloth, faintly scented with cedar. She didn't understand fully, but she knew it was sacred. She brought the items inside with reverence, placed them beside her hearth, and sat beside them for a long time. She ran her fingers across the antlers' carvings, trying to feel their meaning. This wasn't just a symbol. It was a story, a lineage, maybe even a prayer. The ashes, she guessed, were from a fire that mattered. Perhaps the one from the night she saved the bird, or maybe one he had tended on a mountain far from here. That afternoon, she gathered herbs and made a tea for the falcon, now strong enough to flap from beam to floor. "You're part of this," she whispered, as it tilted its head in agreement. She had stopped doubting the bird's awareness. At dusk, she lit her own fire and brought out the ashes. Without ceremony, but with great care, she placed them into the flames. The fire hissed and flared with blue and green as the cedar mixed with pine. She imagined Taza watching from the forest, though she could not see him. She said his name softly, letting it rise with the smoke. Hours passed. The flames burned low, and she prepared to return inside when she saw it, etched into the snow just beyond the firelight, a pattern of 3 interlocking circles drawn with a stick, a symbol, a message. She dropped to her knees beside it, not caring about the cold, and traced its shape with her fingers. It spoke of connection, of past lives and returning spirits. She understood this wasn't just about her saving a bird. Something older had been set into motion. Eliza stood slowly, heart trembling, and whispered to the trees, "I'm not afraid." The falcon landed on her shoulder, light and steady. In the silence, the snow kept falling, but it no longer felt like winter. It felt like a beginning. Eliza woke with a strange calm, the kind that settles in the bones when something sacred begins to unfold. The falcon slept above the hearth, wings tucked in a way that reminded her of folded prayers. She dressed slowly, her fingers no longer trembling with uncertainty, and stepped out into the morning light. The snow had stopped, leaving a glistening crust over everything, and the symbol of 3 interlocking circles remained untouched. She didn't sweep it away. She studied it. Then she walked past it, following her instincts beyond the edge of her land for the first time since she'd arrived 2 years ago. The path through the trees was marked, not with signs she could name, but with deliberate care. Stones arranged in triangles, feathers tied to low branches. At one point, she found a length of deer sinew stretched between 2 trees, hung with small bones that clicked in the wind like a whispering gate. She passed through it. No fear followed, only presence. After an hour's walk, she entered a clearing with a long stretch of frozen creek. Across it, she saw him, Taza, standing beneath a leaning pine. He didn't beckon. He didn't need to. She stepped onto the ice, careful and sure, and made her way to him. They stood just feet apart, silent but somehow known. He wore the same buffalo hide cloak, but beneath it now hung a necklace of carved stone and clay. Around his wrist was a band woven with dark feathers, the same color as Cassie's wings. He looked at her with eyes that saw everything and still welcomed her. Then he knelt and drew in the snow, the symbol again, but this time he added a fourth circle, unbroken, resting at the center of the three. She knelt beside him. "What does it mean?" she asked quietly. He touched his chest, then the drawing, then hers. "You are part now," he said in a voice that felt carved from wood and wind. She understood. Not fully, not in the way of language, but in the way of firelight, of smoke signals and dreams. She placed her hand in his, and together they covered the symbol with fresh snow. It wasn't erasure, it was sealing it in. On the way back, she didn't walk behind him. She walked beside him. At the tree line, he paused. He took a single feather from his wristband and placed it in her hair, above her left ear. Then he stepped back into the forest. Eliza turned toward her cabin with the Falcon circling overhead, knowing now that the fire she'd once feared was no longer something to escape, but to carry forward. That night, Eliza dreamed not of fear or fire, but of water. Clear, rushing, ancient. In the dream, she stood beside Taza at the mouth of a canyon, the Falcon soaring above them in widening spirals. Below, a river ran through stones marked with red ochre symbols, and carved into the canyon wall was the same circle he had drawn in the snow, now etched permanently into the stone, like a doorway that had always been there. She awoke with tears drying on her cheeks, not from sadness, but from something closer to remembrance. The morning was windless and sharp, and the Falcon had already flown. That was new. She stepped outside and found no offerings, no footprints, only silence. And yet it didn't feel like absence. It felt like readiness. That day she worked with unusual purpose. She swept the porch, sanded her table smooth, mended a long torn shawl. In the afternoon, she visited the fire circle and built it anew, this time adding dried herbs Taza had once left in the bundle. As the flames rose, she whispered everything she had never dared say aloud. How loneliness had nearly hollowed her out, how this land had tested her, how she'd once considered leaving without saying goodbye to anything. But then came the fire. Then came the bird. Then came the man who watched from the trees and left her sacred pieces of a language she didn't know she needed. As dusk fell, she heard it. The Falcon's cry, high above, sharper now, stronger. She looked up to see Cassie cutting circles through the cold air, then landing softly on the porch rail. The bird was healed, whole in its brokenness. And in its eyes, Eliza saw something almost human, like memory or warning. She followed its gaze toward the eastern horizon, where clouds gathered low and slow. Something was coming. That night, she sat by the fire inside and added a fourth talisman to her mantle, her own creation. A piece of birch bark carved with all four circles, now joined with twine and draped beside Taza's name. She didn't know if he would return, but she knew she'd be ready if he did. In the middle of the night, the wind rose suddenly, knocking the shutters loose. When she stepped outside to latch them, she found a fresh trail in the snow. Small footprints, like a child's, circling the fire pit once before vanishing toward the woods. There were no children near her land, not for miles. She stood motionless, breath fogging, heart quickening not in fear, but awe. The story wasn't just between her and Taza. The land was remembering something older, and it had chosen her to listen. The following day arrived heavy with stillness. As if the world were holding its breath, Eliza moved through her morning tasks with quiet precision, splitting wood, boiling coffee, feeding the mule. but her eyes kept drifting to the tree line, to the trail where the small footprints had vanished. They were gone now, snow having claimed them, but the feeling remained. Something unseen was watching, not as threat, but as witness. She added more cedar to the fire circle and waited. By noon, the falcon returned, circling once before perching atop the chimney like a guardian spirit, its head tilted sharply eastward toward the river. Eliza understood. She packed a small satchel with dried meat, a water flask, the blue-beaded gift, and the birch bark carvings. With her coat wrapped tight and her shawl pinned high, she followed the falcon's flight through the woods. The path narrowed quickly, winding deeper than she'd ever dared venture. Yet every turn seemed strangely familiar. She came upon a place where the trees grew in a circle, hollow in the middle like a natural cathedral. At its center was a stone altar, low and wide, layered with bundles of sage, feathers, and what looked like a woven doll made of river grass and dyed thread. She stepped closer and saw another symbol carved into the altar, this one not circles, but a spiral that narrowed inward. Beneath it, freshly marked in ash, was her name. Not Eliza, as she wrote it, but the sound of it in another tongue. She didn't need to understand it to recognize herself in it. Across the clearing, a voice spoke. "He dreamed of the fire before you lit it." Eliza turned. An old woman stood beneath a pine, her hair long and white, her eyes rimmed in red clay. Her voice was soft but absolute. "Taza saw the falcon burn in vision. He saw the woman who would carry it." Eliza felt her throat tighten. "Why me?" she whispered. The woman stepped forward, pressing a wrapped bundle into her hands. Inside was a necklace, feathers, beads, bone, and at its center the spiral symbol burned into wood. "Because you walked into the flames," she said. "Not everyone does." Eliza lowered her head, hands trembling around the gift. The woman stepped back into the trees without another word. No sound followed. Just the falcon above, watching. That evening, Eliza returned to her cabin. She placed the necklace above the mantel, beside every piece of the story she had gathered. Her fire burned bright, and the wind whistled soft as a child's breath. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring something final. Not an end. A naming. Winter softened its grip in the weeks that followed, trading its bite for still mornings and the slow return of bird song. The village stirred earlier each day, children chasing the meltwater as it carved new paths through the earth. Eliza found herself changed in ways she couldn't explain. Not louder, not bolder, just steadier. She no longer flinched when someone called her name, because now it was used, not thrown. The tribe had given her one of their own. Wieya, meaning she who walked through flame. They said it with a warmth that rooted her deeper into the land than she'd ever thought possible. Taza did not return every day, but when he did, he brought silence like a blessing, and sat beside her fire as if they'd always known how to share it. Sometimes they spoke of simple things, how the falcon was learning to fly again, though never far, how snowmelt meant new trails would open. But sometimes they said nothing at all, letting the space between them hum with the kind of trust that cannot be forced. The falcon, Kasi, had claimed the rafters of her cabin as home. It flew in and out freely now, no longer broken, just different. Like her. One morning, she found a new fire circle forming near the edge of her cornfield, but this time it hadn't been built by hands. Melted patches in the frost had drawn the 3 interlocking circles into the soil, as if the earth itself remembered the story. Eliza traced them with her toe and smiled. She had stopped asking why these things happened. She only gave thanks that they did. That night, Taza returned with a carved bowl filled with water from the river. He knelt beside the porch and washed her hands in it, healing still pink scars from when she'd first lifted the Falcon from the fire. Then, with quiet ceremony, he pressed her palm to the earth, beside the circle. "Now it remembers you too," he said. When spring finally bloomed, Eliza planted seeds with steadier hands and a quieter mind. She wore the necklace every day. She left offerings at the fire circle without needing to see who took them. And every so often she found new ones in return, sprigs of sage, another bead, or simply a feather left in the doorway. These weren't gifts, they were conversations. The Falcon soared above as she worked, and sometimes children from the village came to watch. They called her Wieya, with smiles that reached their eyes. And though the world still carried sorrow, the snow had kept her name safe, until she was ready to claim it.